Out in bus garages across America, there were machines that could make even the toughest mechanics sigh before the hood ever came up. Some buses earned respect the hard way, mile after mile, decade after decade. And then there were the others, the ones that fought you on every bolt, every wire, every stubborn panel that never quite lined up. If you ever turned a wrench for a living, you probably remember a few of these all too well. They rattled, leaked, overheated, and misbehaved in ways only a fleet shop veteran could truly appreciate. Today, we're taking a slow walk down that memory lane and revisiting 10 buses that tested patience, skill, and sometimes sanity, the ones mechanics hated most. GMC RTS, 1977 to 1993. If you ever worked in a big city transit garage, you probably remember the GMC RTS, one of the most futuristic-looking buses ever built and one of the most frustrating machines a mechanic could draw on the morning shift. Its sleek, rounded body made it a legend on the streets, but that same monocoque construction turned every maintenance job into a wrestling match. Nothing was easy to reach. Not the belts, not the hoses, not even the filters. And if your fleet ran the Detroit Diesel 6V92TA, you knew the pain even better. The engine bay was tight enough to scrape your knuckles just by looking at it. Replacing a turbo, fixing cooling issues, chasing a water pump problem. Those weren't afternoon jobs. Those were all-day battles. Then came the wiring. The RTS was famous for electrical harnesses that ran through nearly every corner of the body. Tracking down a bad ground or a corroded connector could feel like searching for a ghost. And those curved body panels everyone loved to photograph, they were a nightmare to repair after even a minor bump. Some fleets ended up fabricating their own tools just to keep these things on the road. The truth is simple. It was a beautiful bus that never wanted to be serviced. NABI 416 and 436. If the RTS tested a mechanic's patience, the NABI 416 and 436 tested their faith. These buses rolled into American fleets promising modern styling and lightweight construction, but inside the shop, they became known for one thing above all else: electronics that seemed to fail just because they felt like it. The electronic control modules were chronic offenders, glitching, rebooting, throwing false alarms, and sometimes refusing to talk to each other at all. Then there was the body. Composite panels sounded good on paper, lighter, cleaner, more modern, but one fender bender could tie up a repair bay for days. Nothing bent back into shape. Everything had to be rebuilt, refitted, or replaced, and the price tag always seemed to climb. Cooling issues didn't help. The layout was awkward, airflow was poor, and on hot days the engine was ready to boil over. Add in air suspension systems that loved to leak at the worst possible moments, and you had a bus that could squat overnight like a tired old dog. And to top it off, the wiring varied from batch to batch. Nothing was truly standardized, making electrical tracing a guessing game. In the end, the biggest villain was simple: a random electrical system no mechanic wanted to touch. Flexible Metro, late production. By the time we get to the late production Flexible Metro, the story shifts from design flaws to something even harder to fix: a company running out of breath. These buses rolled out during the final, painful years of Flexible's life, and every mechanic who worked on them could feel it. Quality control slipped, parts didn't fit the way they once did, and small problems had a habit of turning into big ones almost overnight. One of the most common complaints was rust, serious rust, starting from the floor and working its way outward. In snowy states where salt ate everything in sight, these Metros could look tired long before their mileage said they should. The HVAC systems didn't help morale either. They were frequent visitors to the shop, shutting down or blowing weak air during the worst weeks of summer and winter. Electrical connectors were another headache. Cheap, inconsistent, and too easy to corrode, they turned basic diagnostics into long troubleshooting sessions. And out front, the axle and kingpins wore down faster than anyone expected, especially on stop-and-go urban routes. In the end, none of this shocked the people who knew the company's finances. The real villain wasn't a single component. It was a manufacturer in decline, and the buses showed every sign of it. MCI G4500. If the late flexible Metro suffered from a company in decline, the MCI G4500 suffered from something just as damaging. A beautiful concept built in the wrong place at the wrong time. On paper, the G4500 looked like a sleek next-generation highway coach. But once production started at the Sahagún plant, fleets across North America discovered the truth. Quality control was uneven at best. Some units rolled out with solid frames and clean wiring, and others left the factory with problems baked in from day one. Mechanics saw it all: misaligned panels, electrical bugs, and structural quirks no amount of shop time could fully cure. Cooling was another major headache. The Detroit Diesel Series 50 was already a hot-running engine, and the G4500's airflow layout didn't give it much help. Overheating became a familiar sight on long grades, and when it came time to service anything at the rear, frustration only grew. The access openings were so tight that even simple belt replacements felt like crawling through a mailbox. Air leaks showed up early and often, sometimes from fittings buried deep in the frame. And that frame? It flexed more than it should, causing doors and exterior panels to drift out of alignment. In the end, the G4500 proved one thing clearly: a coach can look great on paper and still be a disaster in the real world. Eagle Model 15. After the troubles of the G4500, the Eagle Model 15 tells a different kind of cautionary tale, one that begins after the proud Kerrville era had already come to an end. When production shifted and the old standards slipped away, so did the consistency that once made Eagle a favorite among drivers and passengers alike. Mechanics quickly learned that working on a Model 15 meant stepping into a world where quality control was anyone's guess. One coach might be solid, the next might feel like it was welded together on a Friday afternoon. The frame was the biggest giveaway. Welds varied from unit to unit, sometimes clean and tidy, other times rough and uneven. It made long-term structural confidence harder to come by. The electrical system didn't help either. Instead of a uniform layout, each bus seemed to have its own personality. Wires routed differently, components mounted in odd spots, and connectors that didn't always match diagrams. Parts availability turned every repair into a scavenger hunt. Fleets had to call around, improvise, or sideline a coach while waiting weeks for something simple. Even the HVAC systems, normally a point of pride on luxury coaches, were notoriously unreliable on the Model 15. And that's the heartbreak. A beautiful machine, undermined by build quality that changed from one lot to the next. Gillig Phantom, early 8V92 units. By the time we reached the early Gillig Phantom with the Detroit Diesel 8V92, we're stepping into a bus that could run strong on flat ground, but turned into a real headache the moment the route pointed uphill. Mechanics in hilly cities remember these coaches for one thing above all: heat. The 8V92 was already a hot-blooded engine, and the Phantom's tight rear compartment trapped that heat like an oven. On steep grades, temperatures climbed fast, and the small radiator simply couldn't keep up. Overheating became a routine part of life. Drivers complained about noise and vibration, and the shop felt it too. That engine shook the whole rear end, making every job just a little harder on your hands and back. Swapping a turbo or replacing a coolant line wasn't a quick task. It was a full-on wrestling match in a cramped space with sharp edges everywhere. And then there were the brakes. Heavy urban routes with long descents pushed the system to its limits. Heat fade showed up more often than anyone liked, adding yet another item to the maintenance list. In the end, the Phantom wasn't a bad bus. It just had a cooling system that never belonged on North America's hill routes. And mechanics paid the price every summer. Orion V, underfloor oil line. If the Gillig Phantom struggled with heat, the Orion V struggled with something far messier: oil. Mechanics who worked on these buses still joke, half seriously, that leaking wasn't a problem on the Orion V. It was a feature. The long oil line that ran underneath the floor was practically guaranteed to seep, drip, or outright weep over time. On paper, it made routing simpler. In the real world, it turned shop floors into slip zones and forced constant cleanup. And if your fleet lived in the Northeast, rust took the rest of the fun out of the equation. Salt chewed through brackets, shields, fittings, anything that wasn't stainless. Some buses came in every winter looking older than their mileage by a whole decade. The doors weren't much better. Actuators failed regularly, hinges wore down fast, and a mechanic could spend half a shift just getting everything lined back up so the bus would stop squawking at the driver. The HVAC system sat in a position that made access awkward and slow, the kind of layout that turned a simple job into an afternoon project. To make things even more unpredictable, electrical layouts varied from batch to batch. What worked on one bus didn't always match the next. In the end, the Orion V earned its place on this list for one unforgettable truth. When oil leaks become routine, the bus starts fixing your expectations, not the other way around. Thomas Saf-T-Liner EF. After dealing with the Orion V's oil troubles, mechanics who walked over to a Thomas Saf-T-Liner EF faced a different kind of challenge, one measured not in leaks, but in inches. The mid-engine layout was the defining trait of this bus, and it made nearly every job feel cramped. School bus shops across America remember the EF as the model where you had to contort, twist, and reach in ways no human shoulder was designed for. Cooling didn't do the bus any favors either. The airflow path was narrow, the radiator positioning wasn't ideal, and hot days pushed the system right to the edge. Replacing belts or an alternator took about twice as long as on a rear-engine model, simply because access was so tight. And when the turbo cooked itself with heavy heat soak, something it was famous for, mechanics knew they were in for a long afternoon. The electrical bay added to the frustration. Components were packed close together, with limited room to test or replace anything quickly. Even simple diagnostics turned into a slow, careful process. In the end, the Saf-T-Liner EF taught every fleet the same hard lesson. A mid-engine school bus may look practical on paper, but in the shop, it became a mechanic's recurring nightmare. Bluebird TC2000RE. Coming off the tight mid-engine layout of the Saf-T-Liner EF, the Bluebird TC2000RE offered no relief for mechanics hoping for easier access. In fact, many shops discovered that its rear-engine design created a whole new set of headaches. With a Detroit Diesel Series 50 or a Cummins C8.3 stuffed into a compartment that felt 2 sizes too small, even basic service became an exercise in patience. The access panels were narrow and awkwardly placed, forcing mechanics to fight for every inch of room just to reach a filter or tension a belt. Cooling issues showed up early and often. These buses were notorious for developing airlocks in the system, especially after routine service. One small bubble could send temperatures spiking, and diagnosing the problem sometimes took longer than fixing it. HVAC performance didn't help either. In hot states like Texas or Florida, the system struggled to keep up, drawing complaints from drivers and mechanics alike. And for fleets in snowy regions, rust was a constant enemy. Salt would creep into seams, mounts, and frame rails faster than anyone wanted to admit. In the end, the TC2000RE lived up to an old shop saying, "It might have been a budget bus, but keeping it on the road was anything but cheap." Novabus LFS Gen 1. And finally, we come to the first-generation Novabus LFS, a model that looked modern on the outside, but inside the shop felt more like a prototype that somehow slipped into full production. Mechanics all over the US and Canada remember opening the rear hatch for the first time and wondering how they were supposed to reach anything. The engine compartment was one of the least service-friendly layouts ever put on a transit bus. Filters were buried, fittings were tucked behind braces, and even routine checks required patience and long arms. Rust didn't wait its turn either. Early LFS frames showed corrosion far sooner than fleets expected, especially in northern climates where salt ate through anything that wasn't armored. The electronics were young, glitchy, and full of quirks, random warnings, intermittent failures, and modules that seemed to give up without reason. The air system loved to leak, and tracking down those leaks could turn into an afternoon of listening, spraying, and crawling underneath in the cold. And the modular body panels, while innovative, made repairs slow and expensive. Nothing popped back into place. Mechanics summed it up best. The Gen 1 LFS looked like the future, but worked like a prototype that wasn't ready for the street. And that's our walk through the buses that tested the patience of a whole generation of mechanics. Some of them looked sharp, some rode well, a few even became icons on the street. But behind the garage doors, where the wrenches slipped, the bolts seized, and the deadlines kept coming, these machines earned a reputation no shop ever forgot. If you spent years turning wrenches for a fleet, you probably met a few of these troublemakers yourself. Maybe you fought an electrical ghost, wrestled a cooling system, or spent a Saturday chasing an air leak that just wouldn't quit. I'd love to hear your stories. Which buses drove you crazy? Drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep digging into the machines that shaped America's roads, one headache at a time.